The Manchester Hole Tragedy. In November 2005, 14-year-old Joseph Lister, along with 10 classmates, including his friends Charlie and Amy from his school, his math teacher, and a 17-year-old caver volunteer who knew the cave system well, decided to explore the Nidderdale Caves in North Yorkshire, England. The cave system is famous for its 20 entrances, and the group chose to enter through Manchester Hole, a small opening in the ground that leads to a huge cave. They descended through a hole into a massive chamber, about the size of a football field, with a few inches of water on the floor and a 50-foot-high ceiling hung with stalactites. After passing through, they entered a tunnel and climbed down a muddy path into a second, smaller chamber that still held all 11 students and had shallow water. The tunnel then narrowed sharply, forcing them to crawl on hands and knees for 40 feet through twisting passages. At the bottom, a muddy stream soaked their clothes, but led to a small chamber where they could stand again. The math teacher was the last to follow the group. When he reached the small chamber, the guide became very worried because the water level was much higher than usual, something he had never seen before. Even though it was cold and windy outside, there was no forecast of rain. Everyone was standing in freezing water. Their boots were filled with water, and there was hardly any space to move. To make matters worse, the water kept rising, soon reaching above the knees of some students. The guide, confused by the sudden flooding, knew they had to get out quickly, so they decided to retreat. The math teacher went first, followed by the students, one by one, taking the small passage back to the previous chamber. At one point, the teacher and 9 of the students were inside the tunnel when a sudden surge of cold water flooded the chamber. The guide, along with Amy and Joseph, were the last to exit the chamber and enter the tunnel. The tunnel was crowded with students struggling against the rising water. Realizing the danger, the guide, Amy, and Joseph went back to the previous chamber to catch their breath, but the water kept rising and they were nearly submerged. Taking a deep breath, they re-entered the tunnel. This time, the tunnel was clear enough for them to move. The guide led the way, with Amy and Joseph following closely. However, in the previous chamber, the guide pushed Amy out to safety, but Joseph never made it out. The water continued to rise, even in the chamber. The guide tried to go back for Joseph, but the math teacher insisted on taking the other 10 students to safety. Tragically, Joseph drowned in the narrow tunnel, where there was no air. After the incident, the group went to the surface to alert emergency personnel, and they emerged under a blue sky with strong winds but not a single drop of rain. It was later revealed that strong winds had blown water out of the nearby Scar House Reservoir that day. Thousands of gallons of water were forced into the river below, causing it to rise 4 feet in just 1 hour. This surge of water drained directly into the cave system. Normally, water slowly trickles through and seeps into the groundwater, but that day the huge volume overwhelmed the cave's ability to drain, triggering flash flooding throughout the system in just a few minutes. Cave rescuers arrived within 20 minutes after being called. By then, the water had already receded to below their knees. They found the lifeless body of Joseph Lister in the narrow tunnel before the final chamber. Neil Moss Incident. It was Sunday, March 22, 1959, when 20-year-old Oxford philosophy student Oscar Neil Moss, along with 7 other people, 4 of whom were part of the British Caving Association, decided to visit Peak Cavern in the village of Castleton, Derbyshire. The cave system was well known. However, 2 weeks earlier, the same 4 BCA explorers had discovered a new fissure in a side chamber that was 1,000 feet deep. The 8 explorers entered the cave system in the afternoon. They were equipped with ropes, lamps, helmets, and other necessary caving materials. Upon entering, they discovered the Mucky Ducks section, a wet squeeze tunnel that was frequently flooded after rain. This led them to the Boulder Passage, an easier section where they could stand upright while descending and maneuver around various obstructions. Approximately 493 feet into the passage, a 10-feet climb on the north wall of the upper gallery awaited them. High above the steep, muddy slopes was Pickering Passage, a long, narrow crawl space where you had to stretch your whole body to move through. It concluded with an awkward bend and a muddy sump. Above the eye hole, just large enough to accommodate a human body, laid the next challenge. It led to a thigh-deep, muddy pool that connected to the stalagmite chamber, a vast, beautiful part of the cave filled with stalagmites, with a ceiling high enough for a person to stand upright. Despite their fatigue, they approached the newly discovered fissure in the ground. The shaft measured around 3.2 feet by 2.3 feet. None had ventured all the way down there, but it was estimated to be at least 40 feet deep. To be safe, they decided to deploy a 250 feet climbing ladder, and Neil volunteered to go down. He started to descend around 3:30 p.m., pushing the ladder before continuing. He went down 12 feet when he met his first challenge, the corkscrew twist. He succeeded in pushing himself into a 10-foot-long, slightly inclined passageway, and then crawled through it, pushing the ladder as he went. Afterwards, he came face to face with a vertical passageway 18 feet deep, a section none had ventured into before. Throughout his descent, he maintained constant communication with his team above. Excited, Moss dropped further down the tunnel, but unfortunately, he met a boulder there. He knew he couldn't continue descending, so he decided to climb back up. Unfortunately, Moss found himself unable to lift his feet sufficiently to ascend the ladder. He became trapped in an elliptical crevice only 18 inches wide. He called out for assistance, and despite efforts to lift him by pulling on the ladder, it became jammed between the cave surface and his body. Ropes were lowered to help him, but every time they tried to pull him up, they either snapped or got cut by the sharp edge of the rock. His body ended up blocking air from getting into the shaft, so he needed to be rescued immediately before he ran out of oxygen. Some of the cavers left to seek more help. Within a few hours, hundreds of volunteers from across England, along with the Royal Air Force, police, and even the Navy, joined the rescue efforts. Just a few hours after Moss became trapped in the shaft, the rescuers encountered another obstacle. By this time, the air in the shaft had become polluted by carbon dioxide. Moss became disoriented because of it, and he began behaving irrationally. Witnesses said that he wasn't helping at all, that he didn't seem to care about how serious the situation was, and that he even told the rescuers to take a break to get something to eat. Experienced cavers were sent down the shaft to rescue Moss, but one by one, they were forced back by the toxic air. 3 of the volunteers even lost consciousness. Finally, the 4th volunteer, Ron Peters, managed to secure a rope around Moss's chest and began to pull. However, he soon realized that this only worsened Moss's breathing difficulties. The Royal Air Force brought oxygen tanks to ventilate the shaft, and although the quality of air was marginally improved, it proved to be insufficient. The next morning, 18-year-old June Bailey arrived and suggested breaking Neil's collarbone to help rescue him. However, the toxic air stopped all their efforts, and they had to turn back. By Monday afternoon, roughly 24 hours after Moss entered the cave, he was still breathing, but it started to rain, and the entire cave was evacuated as a precaution. When it stopped, the rescuers went back to the shaft accompanied by a Royal Air Force doctor. They did not hear a sound. Moss was not breathing, and he was declared dead on Tuesday, March 24, 1959. Throughout the ordeal, Moss's father, Eric Moss, stayed at the entrance and asked that his son's body remain where it was to avoid risking further injury or loss of life during the rescue. The shaft was sealed with rocks from the stalagmite chamber. That chamber, which held the shaft, later became known as the Moss Chamber, his final resting place.